Hello everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just give people 2 more minutes to get logged in and then we can get started. So if you wanted to grab a drink of water quickly, you have exactly 2 minutes and then we'll begin. Okay, hello everyone, welcome to our webinar, Compliance Policies for Better Microsoft 365 Governance. My name is Sam Iden, I'm the Marketing Manager at Provision Point and I'm on ChatWatch today. So feel free to drop any questions into the chat as we go along and we'll try to answer them for you at the end. Our speakers today are Peter Baddeley, Provision Point CEO, and Jenny Pitts, our Customer Success Manager. Peter is going to go over the theory part and Jenny will be showing us some practical demonstrations. First up is Peter. Peter, are you ready to take it away?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for attending today. So as Sam said, we'll just do a couple of little introduction slides, just explaining to you a little bit about the reasons behind compliance policies in Provision Point workspaces, and then talking a little bit about how they work, and then I'll hand over to Jenny and she'll do a bit of a demo, and then we'll do a brief summary and we'll have an opportunity for questions as well. So what problem are we trying to solve here? It's really all about change. So something has changed to do with your site or team, and that means that the workspace no longer conforms to whatever rules you've defined. So organizations have different strictness about things like governance. So actually non-compliance is very much subjective based on organizational's demands. And that's what we're trying to allow you the flexibility with compliance policies. It's reasonably simple to check one or maybe two sites or teams to see if they are non-compliant. But actually, when you've got hundreds, even thousands potentially, that's really difficult for administrators to manage. And especially, every day, every week, every month, going in and checking to see if things are still correct, or potentially even your policies have changed and you want to now align those sites or teams with your new policies. And what we allow you to do with compliance policies is either to report in the form of on-screen reports or notifications, or to take certain forms of automatic actions, dependent on the rule we're checking, and that will come clear as we go through the course of the webinar today. So we're going to focus on the two rules which are currently available in Provision Point workspaces for compliance policies, and I'll talk a little bit later about what we've got coming in terms of some of the rules. So the first one is disabled owners, so sometimes referred to as blocked owners as well. So simple scenario, I am an owner of multiple teams, or in this case, we're going to use Patty, and that user has then left the organization. So your system administrators has disabled their login, so we don't want them coming in and accessing anything more, but they are still the owner of multiple sites or teams. Now, of course, they can't log in and access because their account is disabled, it's blocked from signing in. But if they're no longer there as one of the owners, they might even be the sole owner, then you've got a bit of an issue because they could be responsible for managing your team. If you look at the design of Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, it's very much owner-centric. Owners are responsible for managing the membership. They're responsible for managing things like privacy. They typically also be responsible for managing things like lifecycle. If we look at how we use owners in Provision Point workspaces, we use them to control and manage things like leases, and they are the ones typically who will come in and extend the lease. So without that clear ownership, then it's not going to be managed the team effectively, and you have that risk of sprawl or data being continually shared incorrectly because someone's not managing that anymore. And so as part of our compliance policies, we have the ability to find teams where owners are disabled and take various actions. And that can be to store that information for reporting purposes. It can be to notify administrators, and it can either be to remove those owners or replace them with someone else. The second compliance policy rule is around external sharing. So being able to check on the external sharing settings set against your sites or sites associated to your team and see if those are correct. And correct can be quite, again, subjective. And when we look at correctness, we think about it in a couple of different ways. We think about it maybe in terms of it being changed. So from what it was originally provisioned as, that someone has changed that sharing setting, or that you've changed the rules yourself. So maybe you originally allowed sharing, but now your organization wants to disable it for certain teams. And so again, you can go and check for those external sharing settings, highlight teams which do not correspond to what you've defined as the rule now. And you can again have actions to store that, notify administrators of non-compliance, or align it. So reset it to a certain setting, which might be what it was originally, or a new standard which you've defined. And that's the two policy checks which we're going to show you today. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about the architecture of how it works. Now, if you're new to Provision Point, some of this will make sense. If you already had some exposure to Provision Point, some of these concepts will be quite familiar to you. So we have something called a compliance policy. That's a sort of wrapper which has a schedule associated with it to say when it runs. Within that compliance policy, we then have a number of different rule sets, which are ways of grouping up our rules together. And then we have a number of individual rules within each rule set. And it might be that you have their rules for external sharing, rules for disabled owners, or some of those other rules which we defined. You can also have multiple rules configured for the same thing. To give you an example, you might have something which notifies administrators that there's an owner which is disabled associated with a team, but then you might have a second rule which will then replace them with someone else. Once you've configured your compliance policy, you can link it to something called a service definition. Most people who use Provision Point will be familiar with the concept of service definition. If you're not, and you've not a user of Provision Point, this is really a template. So it's a template for a SharePoint site, a team. So you're assigning it and saying any sites or teams created with this template will then have this compliance policy run against it. And as part of that, you will then have scheduled runs. So you've defined a schedule. It runs every Friday at 1 a.m. Or once a month, or whatever you configure as that sort of schedule, and it will run repeatedly on that schedule. You'll get a list of scheduled runs, and alternatively, you can run that as an action, so as a one-off check on an individual site or team to see if that is compliant. So you've got the option of scheduled runs across lots of sites or teams, or individual checks against a single site or team. So in the demo today, we're going to show you a few things. We're going to show you how to configure a compliance policy, define its schedule, configure rule sets, and add a few rules to it. I think we're going to look at setting one up around external sharing. We'll show you how they're linked to a service definition, which will allow you to define any specific additional settings, such as unique schedules and things like that. And then we'll have a little look at one which we've already had running in our demonstration environment. So we'll look at the history of our scheduled runs. We'll look at policy checks, see things which are compliant, non-compliant, and then also look at how an individual compliance check can be run or as an action, and show how checks are displayed within the timeline of a workspace as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jenny and let her share her screen, and she's going to run through a demo for us today.
Hello everyone. Hopefully my screen is shared. Peter, hopefully you can confirm that everything is visible for me.
Yeah, all looks great. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. So as Peter said, we're just going to take you through a real quick demo of configuring a compliance policy. Now, Peter may not have mentioned this, but the policies aren't necessarily available immediately in your tenants. So as you can see on my screen, I'm in the admin area and I have an area called policies, which is where I can come in and configure my rule sets and policies. If you don't see that, then it hasn't been enabled for your tenant at this time. So I'm going to start by coming in and going into my rule sets area. So I already have a couple in here, as Peter said. These are ones that I've already created and I can have a look at what is configured within them. And as he said, a rule set is a grouping of rules that you want to keep together for any reason. Now I am going to create an external sharing review set. So I have come in and I've clicked on new to create my new rule set. I can give it a description. So a group of rules for external sharing. And I need to select a usage type. Now at the moment we have a managed compliance policy, which means this is going to check any workspaces that are registered in Provision Point workspaces, so whether they were created through us or imported into us. I can define an icon that will be assigned to this. I'm going to leave that one for now. And I have the choice of enabling and disabling my rule set. So I can keep it disabled until I'm ready to use it. For today, I'm going to enable it. So I can see that's added at the bottom. And when I come into it, I can see that description and that it's enabled, but there are no rules as yet. So I simply click New Rule, and I can then select from a list of our available options. As Peter said, each one has a different set of things that it can do. So we have a mismatch align, which I'm going to add in today. So in here, it gives me a rule description. Again, I can enable or disable it. But really what I need to do is configure what type of mismatch am I looking for and how do I want to align this. So in here, I can look at either checking between my 365 workspace does not match my service instance. I could pick a very specific service definition default that is defined, or one of the override values, or pick a very specific one. So there's lots of configuration options. Today, I want to check that everything should match my service definition default. The service definition that I'm going to use today has only been enabled for within my organization. So external sharing should only be set to that. And this will help me do that. I can also then choose how I want to align that. So again, because I'm using a service definition default, I'm going to say I want to set it back to what that default should have been. So this will make a physical change to anything that is found not to meet this setup. And I can go in and add more rules. As Peter said, I'm just going to add in the report. So it's just going to keep a note of this, and we're going to look at service definition default to match what we did before. Now I've created my rule set. I need to go in and create a compliance policy. So I just come back up here. I can see I've already got a couple of compliance policies in use, and again I can have a look at what those are by expanding them and see if any others need to be added to these ones. So I could come in and add my rule set to the ones that are already here, or I can create a new compliance policy. So I'm going to call this internal only, external sharing. So I know what that is for. And I'm going to give it a description. So again, I'm equally sure what this will do. Again, I need to select that usage type. And here is where I can choose the schedule that this compliance policy will run. So by selecting this, I can choose to run this either at a set number of days at a set time, or every named day at a set time. So for example, it will default to a minimum of every 7 days, but I could change that to 30 days to have this as a monthly review or any other schedule that you may like. And you can choose the time that this will run as well. So obviously we may want to choose to run this out of hours so it doesn't interfere with any of our day-to-day tasks. Again, I can add an icon, and I can pick this from our standard icons. So I'm not sure if I've got any sharing ones. That one will do. And I can enable it. So now I can see my external sharing compliance policy is there, but there are no rules. So I now need to add my rule sets. And I can pick from any of the existing ones that I have and save them. You can see that's added in now. Now you may have noticed there were some notification options popping up. So the notifications really all tie into who do you want to receive any notifications if you should configure a notify rule. So if I show you, here's one I made earlier. On my weekly review, I can see I send a variety of notifications. And within here, I can come in and I can configure at compliancy policy level or at the service definition level if I need to override it for specific service definitions, who should receive those notifications. And I can do that by selecting a template and say whether or not I want to notify any rules that have been created and who should receive those notifications. Obviously, a service definition admin, for those not familiar with our service definitions, is a defined person for each service definition template that is created. Otherwise, it will notify the owners or anyone that requests it, or you can choose to add a bespoke email address in here. So for example, I could do our help@provisionpoint.com. And I can add them in, and they'll also receive our notification rules. So now I've got my compliance policies, I'm going to need to jump into a service definition. So let me find my service definitions here. So I'm in my admin area. This is where I can configure any service definitions. I've got 4 available to me. And this one is going to be looking at internal options. So I can come in, I can see under security that I do have external sharing configured, and it should default to only people within my organization. So if I apply it here, what it's going to do is look for anything that doesn't match this default configuration. So that's going to be useful. On the bottom left, I have compliance, and this is where I can add my compliance policy. Again, I can select that from the list. I can choose to override the schedule. So for this specific service definition, if I do want to run it at a slightly different time to the default, I can override that here and get the same options I had earlier. I can choose a name, day, and a time. I'm going to leave that with the default because obviously that will run when it needs to every 14 days. And I can see that's added in. If I edit it, I can also look at adding any additional notifications. So a useful one here might be that I want to see if for any reason my compliance policy fails to run. So I'm going to notify my service definition administrator who manages this service definition so they can have a look at why. There we go, all configured. So now I've got everything configured, I now just need to wait for that compliance policy to run. I can also enable an action which will allow us to run this on an ad hoc basis. Now, with all of our actions in Provision Point workspaces, these can have an approval assigned to it. You can define notifications and say who has permission to run this. So you may not want your owners to run it. You may just want your admin team to run it. And I can save that in here. So only the administrator group could run this. So our standard owners won't run this unnecessarily. Now, if I come to my directory, I can see I've got a few built up in here. I do have some internal business teams. So I can have a look at the info within those and see that they have got external sharing enabled. So that will be useful for me. As an admin, I can see that I can run the check compliance action as well. So I see internal only, and I can submit that. Now, the reason I've done that is just to show you one of those in action. If I have a look at my timeline, I can see that the compliance has been run on here, and I can see there was no mismatches found. So that's really useful. I can see on an ad hoc basis, this one should be in perfect working order. I also have visibility through a job queue. So as well as seeing any failed requests, and any failed compliance policy runs will also be displayed in the standard request side. But under policies, I have the scheduled runs and policy checks. Now, the scheduled runs will show me any manual requests via actions, as you've just seen, or any requests that run on a timer or via the schedule. So I can see a full history of any compliance policies that have been run. And you can see I've got a mixture in here of my weekly reviews, my disabled owners, and my internal only external sharing policies that have come up. And I can see whether or not they've been compliant or not. On the left-hand side, I also have a status. So this is going to help tell me at a quick glance what's been going on with these. And I can see, obviously, these three here show me that there has been a failure. So at the moment, there was a failure running the compliance policy on some of these options. I can see that with a blocker that no resolution needed to happen, so nothing needed to be changed as well. And I can also see there were some notifications. That's what that speech bubble means. On one slightly higher, I can also see a lightning bolt. Now, this means that an action has been run. A change has physically been made to a workspace. I can see on this one, none of them are compliant, but I can also see a number at the end that tells me how many workspaces are related to this particular compliance policy run. So in this case, one was linked to it, and only so that entire one is non-compliant. But I can see up here I've got one with the number 2, and this means that both are compliant. Now on the right hand side I have some actions, so I can have a look at this in a bit more information, and I can see a little bit of a history of this was previously compliant, and then today on this final run one of them was not compliant. And I can see down the bottom by looking through that the grey one, the disabled report, was the one that failed. And I can click into my policy check for this one and look at a little bit more detail. So again, I can see exactly what was run, and I can see that on this one there was a disabled owner, Patty, and she was removed. So that's why she was non-compliant. Now, if I come back to my scheduled runs and have a look at these failure ones, I can also jump straight to the policy check. So I can jump in and see the 3 that were linked to this, that 3 of them had a failure. And I can also look at the trace log to try and figure out what the cause of that failure may have been. And for this one, I do know it was an issue in my configuration. So it was a failure to retrieve something. So it was my fault. So I can resolve that later and rerun that from my standard request view from here. Now there's lots of things that we can also look at here. We can also jump direct to all of the policy checks. So if I want to have a look at any of the things that have run on a specific service instance or a specific workspace that I've created, I can see them all listed here, and I can go through them and find my non-compliant and have a closer look at them and see exactly what has happened. Now, any of these policies that are run, if there is a change that is made, this will be tracked in our timeline. And if I run an action, they will always be tracked in our timeline. So if I have a look at this one, so I'm going to go in and have a look at my engineering communications team or site, and I can have a look on the timeline, and I can see that previously there was a check compliance run, and this was fine. There was no disabled owners. And then here, a little bit later on, I can see that this did flag that Patty was no longer a valid owner. So I can also then come into my actions and add a new owner in should I need to. Now, if we do enable the notifications, again, here's one I made earlier. Within our notification rules, we can define the content of information that will be sent out. So in my case, my notification rules would send 2 notifications, one about disabled owners and one about external sharing. And I can see for a slightly different team, my marketing office move, there was a disabled owner found, and external sharing permissions didn't match what I wanted to see. So I've received an email notification because I was designated the person that should receive them, and I can then choose to go and make a change if I need to. And the same if there are any failures that should happen. So this is an example of a failure email, it will notify me and it will give me some of the errors that will hopefully help me find the cause of the issue and resolve it. So that's compliance policies in a nutshell. I hope the demo has been useful. Peter, I'm going to hand back to you so you can go through the remaining of our slides, and then we can open up to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. Let me just reshare the slides, and we'll just have a brief summary of what we covered and a few other things about what's coming with compliance policies. And then, like Jenny says, I can see we've had a few questions in, so we'll go through some questions which we've had. So I guess just to briefly recap on what Jenny showed you. Firstly, sort of understanding the configuration around a policy. I've got one of Jenny's policies, which she showed you here, and it's broken down into a number of components. Firstly, the schedule of that policy, so when it runs. Secondly, the different rule sets which we've configured, and then the rules within that. So as we went through things like store, notify, and then different actions based on the nature of the rule. So for instance, remove an owner or align external sharing settings. Jenny showed you scheduled runs, where we can see a history of all the different compliance policies which have run. And in there, we can see a summary of the changes, as well as an indicator to show you how many of those workspaces are compliant. So the percentage of ones which didn't require any action, any change of any kind. We can also look at an individual policy check for a specific workspace, or for a specific site or team. We can see a summary of the rules which have run, including a history of those, so running those across multiple different policy runs. And we can also see the details of the rules which are completed, so any notifications, any changes which were made to those workspaces will also be detailed there for each rule which we've got running. So that's a little bit about compliance policies. Just an opportunity to speak briefly about what we've got coming in the immediate future. So the next updates around compliance policies, which are actually due towards the end of this month, will include some new rules on top of what we've shown you today. So we'll be able to check on workspace privacy. So for Teams, Office 365 groups, group connected team sites, we'll be able to check on privacy in a similar way to what we're checking on external sharing settings, private versus public. We'll also look at workspace naming. So built into Provision Point Workspaces is naming conventions, naming policies for both the title, the name of a team or a site, as well as policies around site URLs as well. And we will be able to check on both of those to check if they actually now conform to your defined standards. So checks on both workspace titles and SharePoint site URLs. And finally, we'll continue to expand our reporting capability. We've already got an API available for compliance policies, as well as an API for a number of other elements of Provision Point Workspaces. But we'll be building out on top of that API a number of reports and options for further reporting, as well as providing options for customers and partners to expand those reports themselves. So that brings us to the end of the core part of our presentation today. I can see we've had one or two questions come in, so I'll let Sam jump back on the line and start asking questions. But if you've got any other questions over the next couple of minutes, please do feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll try our best to answer all of them.
Yeah, so first question that we have, going to be quite a common one. How do we request the compliance policies to be enabled within our tenant?
Yeah, so it depends whether you're already using Provision Point Workspaces or not. So if you're already a Provision Point Workspaces customer or partner, then you can just request that compliance policies be enabled by logging a ticket through our ticketing system for our help desk portal, which you'll all have access to. And they'll be enabled for you. We'll also offer you the option to take you through compliance policies in a bit more detail if you want to find out and go through in a sort of one-to-one session configuring them. There's also a lot of information on our support portal to help you with that configuration as well. If you're not a customer already, then please reach out to us after this session. I know one of our account managers will be in contact as well. We can then offer you a free trial and an opportunity to try out compliance policies once you can get the Provision Point Workspaces app set up. And that's something which we offer as part of our trial experience.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that one, Peter. Next question, how do compliance policies integrate with the Microsoft 365 compliance features?
Yeah, so they're actually separate. So compliance policies are a feature of Provision Point Workspaces. And we focus much more on compliance of the workspace itself. So owners, sharing settings, privacy, workspace name, as I mentioned in some of the new features coming. Whereas the compliance policies from Microsoft typically focus a little bit more around content, the documents within your sites and teams, and they complement each other. So if you do have compliance capabilities configured in the Compliance Center from Microsoft 365, they will continue to work with sites and teams created using Provision Point workspaces, but then you'll have the added capability of managing these compliance checks against workspaces.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think the final one here, the new features that you mentioned on the last slide, will they all be available in the update at the end of the month, or is it going to be a staggered release of those features?
No, so all of those features will be available, and we'll be adding more capability to compliance policies, more rules, more options during the course of future months. The ones I mentioned in the previous slide is what's planned for our planned release in March, but we'll have other releases throughout the course of the year. And once you've got compliance policies enabled in Provision Point workspaces, you'll immediately get those updates. You'll have to configure the new rules to be able to use them, but then they'll be immediately available to you.
Marvellous, thank you. That's all the questions that we have for now, I believe.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I've just got one more slide to or two more slides just to wrap up the webinar, and we'll hang around for another minute or so afterwards if you have any further questions. You'll also get the recording afterwards, so you can come back to us if you have any further questions as you maybe think about this feature a little bit further. So I guess in summary, what do compliance policies let you do? They let you run regular checks on workspaces, link to your service definitions, so link to your templates which are used to create your sites and teams. And they allow you to identify non-compliant workspaces based on what you define non-compliance to be. So owners being disabled, workspaces being externally shared when they shouldn't be. And then you have actions to do things, and that can be report, so storing that information for administrators or compliance managers to manage and check on, notifications going to those same audiences or others, or doing something, and that can be removing owners, replacing them with someone else, or realigning, setting, sharing settings, and the same principle for things like privacy, back to whatever you've now defined that organizational standard to be. And beyond that, I guess key thing, if you're already a Provision Point Workspaces customer, can enable compliance policies for you. If you're not and you're interested in finding out a bit more about compliance policies and the other governance capabilities which we make available using Provision Point, please get in touch. We offer a free 30-day trial where someone like Jenny will guide you through the trial process, talk you through the setup of the app. We'll show you how to configure templates for creating new sites and teams, as well as defining compliance policies, applying lifecycle rules as well. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out if you've got any specific questions or anything else like that. And thank you very much for attending our webinar.
Well, Peter, we do have one more question, if it's okay.
Okay. Yep.
Yep. We have one. It says, please, I'd like to know if Microsoft Dynamics 365 for sales and marketing is related to the Provision Point app.
We do offer integration to technologies like Dynamics 365. So to give a really simple example, if you want to, if say for instance a new customer is created in Dynamics 365 and you wanted that to then go and create a team, for example, we can leverage our API to do that. So then to be able to go and create a team with all the relevant compliance standards which you've defined. So we do have a number of customers which integrate with things like Dynamics.
Excellent, thank you very much. Cheers, mate.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. So thank you very much, everyone. and we'll close the webinar now, and you should hopefully receive the recording in the next 24 hours. Thank you.